Awesome. Without further ado, so as Nazita mentioned, my book project is on teachers and imams from Turkey in West Germany. And so, I mean, before starting this project, I really hadn't realized the important role German and Turkish media would play in the history I'm telling. And as a result of this unexpected development, I'm really delighted to benefit from the expertise that my fellow panelists and presenters and the organizers of this conference bring to the topic. So my presentation today is on the history of Islam in West Germany. As some of you will know, Germany's Muslim population is dominated by Turkish citizens and by Germans with Turkish heritage. Labor recruitment from 1961 to 1973 to address labor shortages brought workers and their families to West Germany. West Germany's Turkish population passed over 1 million when recruitment stopped in 1973. Just trying to make sure I can navigate to the next slide.
Okay, we don't see it yet.
Okay, here we go. So historians have drawn attention to the fact that this population, this Turkish population, this Turkish origin population in West Germany was not initially singled out as Muslims by policymakers or by journalists. So for most West Germans, a wave of media reports beginning in late 1975 on so-called Quran schools and the hojas or religious teachers who taught in them represented an initial exposure to Islam in the country, to Islam in West Germany. Quran schools were extracurricular courses where children learned the Arabic alphabet and the basics of Quranic recitation. In the 1970s and 1980s, innumerable accounts of Quran schools as antiquated institutions characterized by corporal punishment and strict gender segregation captivated West German audiences. So a collection of over 100 articles on the topic in the German Federal Archives constitute my primary body of sources in this talk. So using these sources and through the lens of representations of Quran schools, I'm going to talk today on the competing visions of Islam used to construct the Turkish origin population of West Germany from the mid-1970s through the 1980s. So I want to show how these divergent representations of Turkish Islamic practice in news media in the Federal Republic of Germany, these divergent representations hold important implications for the particular ways that Islam has become institutionalized in Germany. So I will explore three distinct claims to expertise on the Quran school phenomenon, each based on a different implicit and sometimes explicit message about Islam. So the first set of experts who offered testimonials on Quran schools were teachers from Turkey. So in 1970s West Germany, there was little expertise on contemporary Islam. This is a similar situation to the one that was discussed yesterday in the US in the 1970s, something Edward Said talks about in Covering Islam, this crisis of knowledge. So as a result of this absence of expertise on contemporary Islam, Germans relied on Turkish teachers to explain Quran schools. So these teachers, who numbered more than 2,000 by the end of the 1970s, had trained in Turkey and were hired by West German schools to teach Turkish language and culture to immigrant pupils. This was an educated bilingual group, and teachers were often tasked with translating Turkish language and translating perceived Turkish values for German audiences in and outside the school. In describing Quran schools and explaining their prevalence and the harm they allegedly caused in interviews and as experts consulted in German media, teachers emphasized the institution's social and political milieu and their opacity for German audiences, their illegibility, you would say. That West Germans, including government officials, could find no other reliable source of information on Quran schools was precisely the point, according to teachers. Knowing and understanding Quran schools required Turkish cultural expertise. In teachers' accounts, Islam was merely a cover for more salient forces behind Quran schools. Teachers presented Quran schools as a product of reactionary politics and rural backwardness, and anti-modern barred action of patriarchal social forces prevalent in the Anatolian village that had been transplanted wholesale to West Germany. So in teachers' accounts, hojas functioned as something of a foil. So where teachers were progressive and modern, hojas were backwards and limited, a cause and consequence of the traditionalism of rural life in Turkey. Teachers assured West Germans that families sent children to Quran schools not out of any genuine religious feeling, but out of reflexive obedience to the village hoja transplanted to West Germany. Teachers' reports on Quran schools dwelled on accounts of corporal punishment. Hojas were described in stories like those depicted on the screen here as hammering or beating lessons into children. The lengths hojas had to go to ensure compliance seemingly promised West Germans that if the influence of the hojas were curbed, Turkish children would adopt West German values, reaffirming the likelihood of integration if Turks would only jettison their Anatolian cultural baggage. In a 1979 interview, religious teacher Mustafa Shakar objected to the media treating teachers as experts on Quran schools, protesting, to quote, that Turkish teachers are not Muslims and they do not know the teachings of Islam. This criticism was somewhat beside the point. So German media found teachers to be credible experts on the sociological, cultural, and political context driving Quran schools. Their religious content the religious content of these schools was not relevant by this token. So for teachers, the Quran school problem required knowledge about Turkey, which they could provide, not religious knowledge that they might be less equipped to offer, arguably. So in the 1970s, teachers' representations of Quran schools suggested Islamic practice in West Germany was unnatural, enforced. However, after the Islamic Revolution in Iran in 1979, West Germans began to reconsider the role of Islam as an independent force abroad and at home, an independent, and one can see from this magazine cover, a terrifying and destabilizing force. So as Jamil Aydin has observed, the Iranian Revolution enlivened the colonial notion of a uniform Muslim world, a holistic unity of values and institutions. This went hand in hand with the conviction that Muslims were racially distinct and would remain so. Teachers' explanations were out of step with this development, opening up space for a new kind of expertise. One influential expert in this space was the Franco-German journalist Peter Scholl-Latour, a foreign correspondent in Paris. Scholl-Latour had come to know Ayatollah Khomeini in his Paris exile and accompanied the Ayatollah on his return to Tehran in February 1979. Scholl-Latour was fond of showing off a photo of himself with Khomeini. I think it's this one, I'm not positive. And Scholl-Latour imagined his relationship with Khomeini established his bona fides with all Muslims. In West German media, this familiarity with the Iranian Revolution qualified him to comment on Islam in West Germany from his vantage point in Paris, not in West Germany. So in a 1983 editorial in the news magazine Stern, Scholl-Latour counseled that Turks in West Germany should be granted, quote, cultural autonomy, including respect for institutions like Quran schools. According to Scholl-Latour, total assimilation was not to be expected of a devout Muslim, as, to quote the editorial, the true fundamental Islam tolerates no separation between religion and politics and penetrates all areas of life, end quote. So for this reason, Scholl-Latour prophesied inevitable upheaval in Turkey, what he referred to as the hour of the Hojas, when, to quote Scholl-Latour again, the re-Islamization of Turkish neighborhoods in West Germany would spread to the homeland. So Scholl-Latour expected Turks in West Germany would follow the Iranian blueprint closely, a path dictated entirely by Islam. So the best West Germans could do was to guarantee Turkish Muslims autonomy, so their necessarily revolutionary ambitions remained focused on the homeland. In a really crucial difference from teachers' representations, institutions like Quran schools did not have to indoctrinate or coerce children into Islam in Şoldatur's account. The impulse toward Islam, as he presented it, was natural, consistent across generations, accelerating with more time spent in West Germany. So this racialization of Islam in Şoldatur's writing also rested implicitly on his claim to expertise, informed as it was by the notion that Islam was fundamentally consistent across world regions and linguistic and cultural barriers. Şoldatur conflated the Quran school and the Iranian Revolution, the Hoja in West Berlin and the Ayatollah in Tehran, Turkish Islam in West Germany, and the racialized Islam of the imagined Muslim world. Representatives of the Turkish government offered an alternative to Şoldatur's warnings, one which shared his conviction that Islam was a revolutionary force, but one that rejected assumptions about comparability across national contexts. So in the early 1980s, Turkish officials assumed a more prominent place in West German media coverage of Islam. Following the 1980 military coup in Turkey, the State Presidency for Religious Affairs, the Diyanet, led by Tayyar Altıkulaç, pictured here, was focused on curtailing opposition in the diaspora. Like Şoldatur, Altıkulaç was troubled by the Iranian example. However, he was convinced that Turkish state supervision and the cultivation of a nationalist Islam would forestall revolutionary threats emanating from West Germany. During frequent visits to West Germany, Altıkulaç drew attention to the dangers of internationalist Islam, while also making a case for the Turkish government's right and capacity to stabilize Islam in West Germany. Thus, in a 1980 press event, Altıkulaç referred to Turks in West Germany as being in the clutches of preachers of violence, self-proclaimed hojas, and false prophets. Turkish citizens, Altıkulaç claimed, had turned to such figures because Turkey had neglected the religious needs of its European diaspora. As he put it, if a field is not cultivated, then weeds will grow there. So Altıkulaç promised that the Diyanet would cultivate the field and deal with weeds by sending its own religious teachers and imams. So Islam, managed by the Turkish state, was not to be feared. Unregulated Islam, on the other hand, threatened Turkey and West Germany. So this line of reasoning was consistently expressed by Altıkulaç and other Turkish officials in media appearances in the 1980s. Intriguingly, once Turkey began to send more religious personnel to West Germany, the official Turkish viewpoint was echoed by many German officials in media appearances who praised Turkish state institutions for their neutrality. So accordingly, the German government accommodated Diyanet plans to establish a partner organization in West Germany in 1984. West Germany permitted only imams and religious teachers sent by the Diyanet to enter the country. So hojas who might have received visas under the former regime had renewal applications denied. Mediated images of Quran schools had profound effects in the decision-making process leading to this extraordinary step and justified it after the fact. Thus, in rejecting a Quran school teacher's appeal against a visa rejection, a German court, pictured here, cited teachers' reports on Quran schools, cited fear-mongering about Islam's revolutionary potential, familiar from Şoldatur's work, and also cited arguments about the Diyanet's unique ability to assess the reliability of imams and religious teachers. So in spite or because of the ways they contradicted each other, these discourses could still work in tandem. So I use the word competing in the title of this talk, but that actually doesn't quite capture the dynamic here. So teachers objected to Şoldatur's views and those of the Diyanet, which were themselves inconsistent with one another. Nevertheless, these discourses reinforced and built upon one another. So teachers drew attention to the Quran school problematic. Şoldatur's Islamophobia raised the scale of this threat, and the Turkish government echoed concerns about the dangers posed by Islam, but suggested a way out amenable to West Germans. West German officials accepted the solution, and media tacitly endorsed its underlying assumptions. So in the 1980s, the Diyanets, religious institutions in West Germany, were the subject of strikingly sparse media coverage. Islamic institutions unaffiliated with the Turkish state, on the other hand, were represented as dangerous and radical. So in Mamdani's formulation, good Muslims were Turkish nationalists, bad Muslims, independent, international in outlook. So in that sense, the discourse of the Muslim world persisted, but in West German media, Turkish state Islam was an exception. So this move from a broad, centralized category of Muslim to a narrow, national, though still a centralized category of Turkish Muslim, is lost in accounts depicting German perceptions of Turks moving steadily in one direction, from guest worker to Muslim, as it is often put. That is, from being defined by class or nationality to being understood inevitably in religious terms. So to conclude, by the early 1980s, Islam had acquired the fixity and heredity associated with race, but Turkish Muslims were racialized as Turks, not primarily as part of the imagined Muslim world. Understanding how this racialized category of Turkish Muslim acquired its particular institutionalized form requires attention both to what Rogers Brubaker calls competing reifications of Islam and to the under-recognized influence and interrelationship of competing and even contradictory mediated images of Islam. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Brian. That was wonderful. Really privileged that you were able to share your scholarship with us. Okay, so I guess we'll go on to the next presenter, who is Senna Aziz. So if you don't mind, Brian, stopping your screen share.
Yes, sorry. You can tell that I'm at a university that doesn't use Zoom.
Yeah, I mean, everybody has their own platform, right? And then we just use one platform. I think I can stop here. There we go. Okay, so Senna, are you ready?
Yes, I am.
Okay, am I pronouncing your name correctly?
Yeah, that's fine.
Wonderful. Okay, so Senna Aziz has over 15 years of experience working with both the public and private sector, providing policy advice on matters related to commercial operations. Currently, Senna is working as an analyst with the Department of Treasury and Finance in the state of Victoria, Australia. Her research areas are women empowerment, international security, and international law, particularly in the Middle Eastern and North African region. She holds a Master's of Arts in International Relations from the University of Melbourne and wishes to pursue a career in international law and post-conflict reconstruction. So without further ado, Senna, the floor is yours. I will keep time and interrupt you if it goes over. But I just wanted to give you a preview of that.
Sure. Thanks, Nazika.
Sure.
I hope everyone can see my screen.
Yes, we can see it. We see the PowerPoint.
Thank you so much for the kind words. My topic for today's analysis is Iraq war in Hollywood films and how entertainment media helped securitize Islam. While Islamophobia and Arabophobia existed before 9/11, in the post 9/11 era, the portrayal of Islam in Hollywood films quintessentially advances the idea of a backward religion struggling to cope with the contemporary demands of life, a religion that sanctions violence and justifies the killing of innocent people. This backwardness of the religion and by extension all its adherents pose a threat to the modern way of life, deserving religious profiling, unlawful surveillance, and denial of basic human rights by the authorities. The mere association with a certain belief system has also justified the wholesale hatred and suspicion by the American public. I would like to explore these underlying anti-Islamic themes in the mainstream movies covering Iraq invasion using the securitization lens. My argument is that the entertainment media aided the state in the application of its securitization policies against a religion and a certain people to further their undemocratic interests. Before I analyze the films, I would like to briefly discuss the theoretical framework underpinning today's analysis. Conceptualized by the Copenhagen School within the International Security Studies, securitization is understood as a process of presenting an issue as an existential threat, a threat that requires and justifies deviation from the standard legal rules and social norms. Securitization is achieved through a speech act or the securitizing by the securitizing actor. An actor authorized to grant a matter the status of a securitized issue by virtue of institutional backing. The traditional securitizing actors can be political leaders, bureaucracies, government, and lobbyists. Securitizing move is premised on the Speech Act theory, which postulates that certain statements don't just convey a message, but they are in fact performative in nature. For instance, the utterance of a threat does not just impart information, it also invokes the feeling of fear and insecurity. As such, the validity of these statements cannot be judged as true or false at the time, but these necessitate the urgent adoption of a set of procedures to deal with the threat constructed. These procedures can, and as recent history bears witness, does deviate greatly from the standard legal framework. In addition, securitization requires a referent object and an audience with pre-existing notion on the matter for effective threat construction. A referent object here is an ideal under attack. So looking through securitization framework, Hollywood, with its sufficient social capital, not only within the US but worldwide, has acted as a securitizing actor. The portrayal of Islam, Arabs, and Muslims in the post 9/11 films helped feed the dominant view in the public, as well as in the political and academic circles, that Islam, and not just a small group among its adherents, has become a security concern. These assumptions, facilitated by the industry, helped the authorities securitize a religion and a region, justifying the illegal and unlawful preemptive steps taken by the administration within the US and abroad in the name of national security. It is impossible to research media portrayal of Muslims and Arabs in the US without citing the expansive research conducted by Dr. Jack Shaheen. Professor Shaheen analyzed close to 1,000 movies to document the continued vilification of Arabs and Muslims, spanning well over a century. The 100 years of persecution has maintained the underlying theme of othering, although the focus was adjusted to match the political realities. For instance, since the 80s, Muslim fanatics had gradually come to hold a permanent dishonorary position in Hollywood's vilification program. Their religious affinity, rather than their ethnic or national identity, has been superimposed in the films. The lecherous, greedy sheikhs of the past, lusting after blue-eyed American heroines, graciously stepped aside so the radical Islamist could claim the spotlight. These scheming, immoral sheikhs still reside on the fringes, to be summoned back as needed in films like Taken, Dreamer, Click, and many others. War propaganda manipulates the deep-seated sense of duty and superiority among the masses. The same notion of superiority is carried across to Iraq war films, where Iraqi locals are portrayed as self-interested and inept, needing American soldiers to help and train them. The notion serves the dual purpose of fueling public sense of pride while justifying the prolonged presence of the US forces abroad. In the 2006 film, Home of the Brave, an Iraqi soldier is added to the medical supply run at the last minute because, quote, it's the only way they are going to learn, end quote. Coincidentally, former President George W. Bush, in a June 2005 speech, stressed upon the increased involvement of Iraqi locals to take responsibility for their security. Motion pictures are a reflection of political realities, but in the case of Iraq war films, these tend to focus too narrowly on an already established angle at the expense of a broader, somewhat impartial view. Similarly, in the 2017 film, The Wall, a trapped American soldier is bewildered by the skill of an Iraqi sniper. He later deduces that that's because the sniper was trained by the US forces. The message for the audience is that the standard par excellence in peace as well as in conflict is the US. Silver screen vilification is facilitated by a sweeping mischaracterization regime required for the effective othering of the group. The distinction between the Hollywood S and Islamic them is never benign. The other speaks a different language, maintains an aggressive glare for the camera, and invokes the name of a different lord. Hollywood films tend to over-homogenize Muslims residing in all parts of the world. For instance, Allah on silver screen has come to be associated with Muslim God, when Arabic-speaking Christians pray to Allah as well, and South Asian Muslims call upon Khudawand or Khuda, a Persian word for God used by the followers of another monotheistic religion, Zoroastrianism. In the world of Hollywood films, however, an Arabic-speaking terrorist is always a Muslim. A terrorist can be an Arab or a non-Arab Muslim, but when the antagonist hails from the Middle East, he or she is always a kufiya-wearing, prayer bead-carrying, malevolent-looking Muslim. The absence of a non-Muslim Arab in these films helped to keep the Muslim Middle Eastern world separate from the Christian West. The three Abrahamic religions trace their roots in the region, and today Christians make up to 5% of the population in the Middle East. But Hollywood Arab is mostly violent and always Muslim. Azan is another prop employed by the industry to emphasize the distinction that unlike modern secular societies, Muslim world remains exceedingly religious. American Sniper begins with the call to prayer and can be heard in Home of the Brave, War Machine, Body of Lies, to name just a few films. War film or not, Azan is an ever-present sound in the scenes set in a country with considerable Muslim population except India. Here, the sound remains conspicuously absent in scenes set in India, which has the third largest population of Muslims in the world. The 2009 film Body of Lies probably contains the most damaging dialogues and stereotypical imagery of all post 9/11 films I have analyzed. The second dialogue on the screen, for instance, delivered by Leonardo DiCaprio, a CIA operative, pits every practicing Muslim against every non-Muslim. It defaults the assumption that a practicing Muslim is intolerant, secretly scheming to kill or convert the infidels. So he is worthy of suspicion and hatred. Salat becomes the enemy of the state, so attack by fellow society members on the mosque and on Muslim visiting it are justified. And religious profiling and surveillance by the authorities becomes a necessity. As mentioned by presenters yesterday, this hatred has caused several Muslim and Sikh families in the US the lives of their loved ones. According to a report by Pew Research Center, a total of 127 instances of Islamophobic attacks were reported to the FBI in 2016. Impact of the 2016 presidential election campaign were not limited to the US only. The Australian Islamophobic Register documented receiving 551 reports of anti-Muslim attacks in the same year, of which 349 incidents were verified. Reporting of such incidents to the authorities or to the nonprofit organization is voluntary. Most victims hesitate to report their concerns, or the reported complaints are investigated under related but various categories, such as hate crime or bias-motivated attacks, thus barring the formation of an accurate picture of hate crimes against Muslims and Islam. Another recurring theme in Iraq war movies is the persistence of unwarranted violence by the Muslims performed as a sanctified duty. The horrific end of the local Iraqi school administrator Qadir in Sandcastle for helping US forces, the torture and near execution of DiCaprio in Body of Lies, and the unnecessary pronouncement of torture by Iraqi sniper Juba in The Wall are few of such examples. Unlike the American protagonist, who hold family, country, and God dear to his or her heart, the antagonist is irrationally devout and unwaveringly malevolent. They call on Allah when they murder the innocent or sacrifice their own for his pleasure. Their life, their family, their children are all but just a vehicle to get the golden ticket to heaven and all its promised gains. They make these sacrifices and offer their youth only to gain the ordained religious glory. In Home of the Brave, Samuel L. Jackson in a drunken tirade says that Muslim mothers procreate with the sole intention of sacrificing their kids to kill and be killed. Backwardness of the religion also manifests itself in the depiction of Muslim women in these films. They are robbed of their agency, floating around soundlessly in the background. They become the faceless consenting mothers on the other side of the phone, or devoted but mute wives. These Muslim women, like Muslim terrorists, are rarely afforded a backstory or a character attribute. They birth terrorists, aid terrorists, or die a terrorist themselves. That's the extent of their being in Hollywood films on Iraq War. War propaganda on Iraq has mercilessly but effectively reduced a diverse group of people in an oversimplistic, dangerous them, where us is the fair and firm victor, them is an irrational, overzealous, and violent group out there to diminish the civilized, secular us. The portrayal of Iraqis and Muslims in the analyzed films follow the same reductionist approach. The ethno-sectarian diversity in Iraq, the achievement of Iraqi people before the Iran-Iraq war, and accounts of their suffering during the decade-long severe sanctions prior to the 2003 invasion remain out of industry's focus. Muslims in Hollywood films stay confined to the war and conflict genre. The quintessential bad Muslim, a fanatic bent on mass destruction, and the token good Muslim providing support to the hero or heroine to save yet another day. Regular Muslims, however, remain elusive, a regular setting for Muslims beyond creative reach. It is unimaginable to conjure up a silver screen, mosque going Muslim who plans weekend getaways instead of mass destruction, who worries about screen time for their toddlers rather than laying the foundation for their lifelong hatred for the infidels. A Muslim next door who pines for summer instead of the virgins waiting in heaven. And so the public, caught up in the hum of their routine, choose to watch and believe rather than imagine the unimagined. We are witnessing gender and racial revisionism in recent releases, both in the Hollywood films and on television. Few movies even boast small but reassuring inclusions of Muslim outside the realm of national security. I will conclude my analysis with the hope that in the not so distant future, Muslims without an adjective become strong enough to prevail on good and bad Muslims of present day Hollywood. And like an impactful securitizing actor, Hollywood can prove to be equally effective as a desecuritizing agent. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So fascinating, and really appreciate the lens that you've brought to this conference, especially in discussing the entertainment media. Thank you. Next up, we have Mohammed Reza Vedadipour. Mohammed Reza, are you? There you are. Hi.
Hi, how are you? Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum assalam. So I'm going to introduce you. Mohammed Reza is a British Iranian film and documentary director producer based in London. In 2010, Mohammed Reza completed his first master's degree in film production at the London Metropolitan University. And in 2016, he completed a second master's in Islamic studies at Middlesex University. He's currently studying for a PhD in Hollywood and minority representation. And so today he's going to be talking to us about Hollywood's representation of Iranian identity from 1979 to 2019. So without further ado, the floor is yours. I'll keep time.
Thank you so much. Just gonna share my screen. I just wanted to also thank the organizers, especially Dr. Khalil and yourself, Dr. Lajawadi, for all the efforts you put to organize this conference, and inshallah it will be a success. Right.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Okay. Okay. So, the Iranian identity and its representation in the American films have always been a fascinating part of cinema for me, due in part to my Iranian heritage and love for films, and especially American cinema. So I was interested in analyzing how the Iranian identity has been represented by the major Hollywood studios since the 1979 Iranian Islamic Revolution, a very important turning point between the US and Iranian relations. We can say in confidence that there is no one Iranian identity like there is no one American or British identity. We're all carrying multiple identities: gender, race, ethnicity, age, and so forth. However, it's important to decide on the framing of my research and which aspect of the Iranian identity should be analyzed that is measurable in both quantity and qualitative manner. My focus for this research will be how do Hollywood films negotiate between the US foreign policy motifs and the Iranian identity. In this presentation, we ask, can the Hollywood referencing for the Iranian identity be found in the hegemonic foreign policy of US governments? By analyzing the data from the 14 films released by the major Hollywood studios, we can look more closely at the relationship between the US motifs and Hollywood representation of the Iranian identity. It's no secret that since the 1979 Iranian Islamic Revolution and after the overthrow of the Shah, successive US governments and Iranian governments have had a turbulent and contested relationship. This presentation will analyze the relationship through the lens of Hollywood films. Before discussing the data from the 14 Hollywood films, we need to clarify the important intersectionality between the US government foreign policy, the Iranian identity, and Hollywood studio films. We can summarize the 40 years of the US foreign policy approach to Iran through 5 motifs that have been prevalently presented as points of contention in various degrees by each subsequent American government. To what extent are these 5 essential motifs depicted in Hollywood films may suggest the proximity between their presentation as found in political policy and media depiction. Most of you will have heard or read some, if not all, of these media talking points at some point on major television news channels, major newspapers, or radio shows. The talking points would usually be presented by US government officials, advisors, or think tank experts. They are: Iran is the leading state sponsor of terrorism, Iran's dangerous ballistic missile program, Iran's destabilizing regional behavior, Iran's record on human rights, and Iran's nuclear threat. These motifs have been used by the US government ever since the Shah was removed and the Islamic Republic was installed into power. Before the collapse of the Shah's regime in 1979, it would be hard to find any, let alone all of the above talking points about Iran in any of the major news outlets. It's also important to define what is meant by the term Hollywood films for the purpose of this analysis. The major studios make up the bulk of Hollywood film industry, which in 2019 accounted for around 82% of the US box office revenue. This places the following studios in positions of power and influence. To better analyze how Hollywood films represent the Iranian identity since the 1979 Iranian Islamic Revolution, we need to clarify what Hollywood films we are examining. The major Hollywood studios are Paramount Pictures, Sony Pictures with its subsidiary Columbia Pictures, TriStar Pictures, Universal Studios, Walt Disney Studios with its recent acquisition or merger with 20th Century Fox, Warner Brothers. These are the top main major studios in Hollywood. As you can see in the chart in 2019, 20th Century Fox was still one of the major Hollywood studios. But by early 2020, the completion of the merger between Walt Disney and 20th Century Fox was completed. Another Hollywood film company that features in my analysis is MGM. It was one of the original major Hollywood film studios, but in the last few decades, it has lost its dominant position. There is no doubt that many films produced outside of these major Hollywood studios depict the Iranian identity. But I wanted to focus on the relationship between these film companies, as they represent the majority of the market share of film releases in the US. So these are the 14 films that were released between 1979 and 2019, which depict the Iranian identity. They make reference to Iranian identity, or they have plots that are related to the Iranian identity within the story of the films. 6 of the films were released by Warner Brothers or one of its subsidiaries. 3 films were released by Paramount Pictures. 2 films were released by Sony Pictures or its subsidiary. 1 film was released by a Disney subsidiary. 1 film by MGM, and 1 film by Universal. As you can see in the next graph, most of the films fall into the action, comedy, thriller, and drama genres. However, no film fell into the fantasy, horror, or historical genres. So the next data is interesting because we can begin to see how the Hollywood films negotiate the US foreign policy motifs that we mentioned earlier. Out of the 14 films, 5 films depict Iranians as terrorists or supporting terrorism. None of the films depict a threat from Iran's ballistic missile program. Only one film depicts Iran's destabilizing regional behavior. 6 of the films reference or demonstrate Iranians' abuse of human rights inside or outside of Iran. Only one film analyzed depicts Iran as a nuclear threat. 6 of the films also depict Iranians acting in a criminal manner or as aggressive people. Most of the representations of the Iranian identity depicted in the various films can be classified as not influential or new points of reference. For example, the 3 times Iranians are shown in the film Down and Out in Beverly Hills, 1986, there's no reference to any of the foreign policy motifs. The representations fall mainly into Orientalist tropes of exotic harems and rich Middle Eastern men with multiple wives. Even the comedy thriller Into the Night, 1985, has a strong component of Iranian identity in the various character representations and plot story. However, the characters do not fall into the US foreign policy motifs. The Iranians depicted are criminals working for criminal realtor Shaheen Parvizi, who is related to the former Shah's royal court and have nothing to do with the current Iranian government. The 2 films that stand out as strong advocates of many of the US foreign policy motifs are Not Without My Daughter, 1991, and Argo, 2012. These 2 films have been highlighted by academics and film critics as damaging to the Iranian identity, both racially and religiously. What is noteworthy about these 2 films in comparison to the other films discussed is that they are based on real events, giving them a stronger claim to authenticity and representation. The film Not Without My Daughter, based on the memoir of Betty Mahmoudi, the main character of the story, utilizes one of the main foreign policy motifs throughout the film. Iranians abuse human rights through the kidnapping and forced captivation of a white American woman and her daughter by her Iranian Muslim husband. The abuse of human right motif also leads to the Orientalist, racist, and Islamophobic tropes of Muslims as misogynist, the abuse of women by men and other Muslim women, hatred of the West and Westerners, Muslims as harsh, extremist religious zealots, Muslims as unreasonable and angry, Iranians and Muslims as undemocratic. Not Without My Daughter has gone a long way to reinforce negative stereotypes about the Iranian Muslim identity. And the film has been used by some teachers in American schools to negatively educate young, impressionable children or teenagers about the perceived reality of the Iranian Muslim identity. The other film that stands out from the data analysis is Argo. Not only is the film about the daring plan by the CIA to rescue American embassy staff trapped in Iran during the early 1980s, but the 2012 film was also based on a book written by the CIA operative Tony Mendez, and the 2012 film was produced with the involvement of the CIA. Unlike Not Without My Daughter, the film Argo begins by providing a background narrative of the Iranian history, including the US orchestrated Iranian coup of 1953 and the support the US gave to the Shah and his ruthless secret service. This unusual introduction by the film suggests the possibility of a nuanced and discursive representation of the American and Iranian relationship and history, not depicted in previous Hollywood films. However, it's not long before the film changes gear and depicts chaotic chanting mob scenes and angry Iranian Muslim men and women clad in dark clothes violently attack and invade the US embassy in Tehran. From then on, all the usual anti Iranian tropes begin to show themselves: rude and abusive government officials, violent and scary mobs aimlessly chanting and protesting in the streets against America, always against America, burning of American flags and effigies, use of child labor, random public executions, militarization of the Iranian identity with constant depictions of armed Iranian soldiers found everywhere from the streets to the airports, the aggressive, irrational, unreasonable anti-Western Iranian public, fundamentalist jihadi government agent who is searching for enemy infidels. One important element in the film Argo demonstrates that no other Hollywood film before it had attempted to do was to address the US complicity and support for the Shah's oppressive and undemocratic regime, which had eventually led to the dissatisfaction of the Iranian public and then to the 1979 Iranian Islamic Revolution. British diplomat Martin Williams, who was in Iran during this time period of the story, has debunked many of the parts of the film which were added for dramatic effect, which did not happen. A closer analysis of the ideological politics of the US government during the Obama's term indicates Hollywood studios were the busiest at producing films that better reflected the foreign policy motifs. These films were released before, during, and after the signing of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or the Iranian nuclear deal in 2015, the most important breakthrough between the US and Iranian government since the 1979 Iranian Islamic Revolution. In conclusion, from the data, it is clear that many of the Hollywood films representing the Iranian identity since 1979 have not necessarily replicated or followed the US foreign policy motifs about Iran. Hollywood cannot be characterized as a monolithic entity that is at the beck and call of the US government when it comes to foreign policy. However, Hollywood as a commercial, creative, and entertainment industry, it is governed by the capitalist trends that influence American society at large. The question remains for further research if the mainstream media consisting of American television news networks, newspapers, and think tanks, which follow more closely the US foreign policy motifs about Iran, have a greater impact on cultivating and perpetuating a negative representation of the Iranian identity than the sporadic depiction produced by the Hollywood film studios. The film industry does not create its stories and characters in vacuum from the American society, but it seems to negotiate the representation of the Iranian identity somewhat differently than the other mainstream media outlets. As data suggests, the film releases from the major Hollywood studios have been more in line with the foreign policy motifs of Obama's administration than the previous US governments. This could be a reflection of the Obama administration's ability to court the major Hollywood studios better than any other US government in the last 40 years. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much. You were right on time. It was really amazing.
I've timed it, so I hope I
Yeah,
didn't
it was
go
like
over.
30 seconds to go. Okay, thank you so much. All right, so last but not least, we have our final presentation from Angeliki Koletsou. She holds a BA from the Department of Foreign Languages, Translation and Interpretation of Ionian University in Greece and speaks Greek, English, German, Russian, and Farsi. So accomplished. She completed her MA degree, Politics, Language, and Intercultural Communication in the same department, and her focus on Iranian studies. She's worked as a translator for Amnesty International Greece in the Greek Council for Refugees, and also as a freelancer. Currently, she's begun her PhD on visual representation of modern Iran in Western popular culture. Without further ado, Angeliki, if you'd like to begin your presentation, I will time you. And then to our attendees, please do feel free to begin putting your questions in the Q&A box. Angeliki? Angeliki, can you hear me? We might have a technical issue. Hi. Are you on another device?
Can you hear me? Because I have some technical issues.
Can you hear us okay?
Yes.
Yeah, we can't hear you very well.
Maybe while Angeliki is working on that, we could take some questions.
Okay.
The Zoom era, of course. Yeah, so Angeliki, perhaps what we can do is we can take questions for the other presenters while you work on your. Okay, so I invite everybody to offer their questions for one another. I think we should start with our panelists. So Mohammed, Reza, and Brian, and Senna, do you have any questions for one another?
I don't have a question, but I'm really looking forward to Angelika's presentation because it's similar to mine.
It's so similar.
I
yeah.
would love to see what she has to say.
Oh, here you are.
Here she is.
Hello. Yes. Hi. I'm sorry about that. I'm experiencing some technical issues. I had. Can you hear me now?
Yes, absolutely.
Now on my mobile phone, because I had already prepared the presentation. Well, I'm not able to share it anyhow. I will try to be concise.
Would you like to email it to me and I can share it?
Yes, that would be great. That would be great. But I don't have your email address. I don't know if I could.
It's my first name at msu.edu.
Okay.
Yeah, and I can just download it.
I'm just sorry about that. I don't know. Everything seems not to be working today.
No, it happens to the best of us. You're reminding us that we're only human and we're doing the best that we possibly can.
I would like to thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to present my work whatsoever in any way possible. It's really glad to be here, and I've already enjoyed all of the presentations so far. So what is your email exactly? I'm sorry.
My first name, so Nazita @msu.edu.
Okay, I'm trying. Okay, I'm trying, but okay, everything seems not to be working today. I don't know. Yeah. I could start with because I don't want to delay you, and well, I don't know if I will be able to send the presentation. Okay, now it's possible. So you told me that it's your name, Nazita. Okay, MSU. Yes. Okay. Yes, I got it. Okay. I'm sorry. Really sorry for the delay.
Not at all. Not at all. You could explain your project as we wait for it all to happen.
Yes.
Everybody understands.
Yes. Okay.
So experiences.
Yeah, I'm really sorry about that. So the title of my research is Views of Iran by the American Film and Industry and Television Series from 2001 until the present. And this research was, this presentation actually, if I would be able to send it to you, was based on my master thesis. It was based on my master thesis. Okay, during this thesis, 15 films, which were either Hollywood films or European and American co-productions, were examined. Okay, these films were examined with methodological tools of critical discourse analysis. I have sent you the email now. I don't know if you have it.
Me too. Yeah, I'll keep an eye on it, and then the second it comes out.
Okay, right. So I have examined 15 American movies and 4 television series, which were released in the period 2003 to 2019, and they were examined as audiovisual text with the methodological tools of critical discourse analysis. Now, why from 2001 and no from 2009 from 1979, let's say. So 2001 was considered a turning point because of the tragic events of 9/11, and which among other things resulted in the dissemination of border terror, the war in Afghanistan and Iraq, and the rapid increase in Islamophobia and Islamophobic depictions, especially of Arab Muslims. So the basic research question of my research was, does this apply to Iran? Which are the factors shaping the media footprint of the Iranian people and the Iranian state as a whole? And are the images portrayed in cinema and TV trapped in Orientalistic, Iranophobic, and Islamophobic portrayals? In particular, what was examined was which are the representations associated with Iranian people and Iranian state? When do these representations take place and how are they structured? Especially what I was trying to examine was under which political circumstances are these images constructed, and what is the purpose actually of these portrayals? So what interest do these portrayals serve? The theoretical background of my research was based on the pivotal work of Edward Said's Orientalism, of course, and combined with the American soft power, the ideology of soft power as expressed by Nye. To quote, soft power is the ability to get what you want through attraction rather than coercion or payment. It arises from the attractiveness of a country's culture, political ideas, and policies. So I was trying to examine how how these theories are reflected in the cinematic and TV representations, while also examining the micro level and the macro level of these films. Now, as a micro level, I examined the ideological discourse expressed in the dialogues of the films, the musical background, and also the cinematography, the cinematic techniques associated with the ideological discourse, such as editing, for example. And as a macro level, it was studied. I studied the historical and socio-political factors shaping the portrayals of Iran. That is, the socio-political factors that were happening when the socio-political factors of the film's narrative and production time, because sometimes they were different. Now, I cannot actually say it to you, but it doesn't matter. Now, the findings suggest that 52% of the people, of the Iranian people, are portrayed either as a crowd, as fanatics. The women seem to be dressed entirely in black chadors, and there are either direct or indirect references to the mullahs. So 47% of the people, of Iranian people, are portrayed as villains. And 68% of all the representations, either in TV or cinema, are characters superficially structured. So these characters seem to have no motive for their actions, and and they are not that well structured. There were indeed some films with positive or neutral portrayals, favorable to certain segments of the Iranian population, so to say. But even though those positive characters were in the end imprisoned, ridiculed, or tortured whatsoever. So, in regards to the themes of the films, most of the films, 12 to 19 films contain the theme of escape or the theme of captivity. Okay, I'm now on the 11th page of the presentation, because I can see the two series, because I'm now I'm on page 9. I'm sorry, I'm on page 9. Okay, so thank you very much for that. Thank you. So, okay, most of the films, as you can see, It contained the theme of escape, and almost 8 out of 19 films or TV series were directly linking Iran with terrorism. Now, take for example the series Homeland. The second season of Homeland blames Iran exclusively for an attack on the premises of CIA. It was supposedly constructed exclusively by Iran and some other organization. There were certain films that were referencing, of course, to the Iranian nuclear facilities and the possible threat of Iranian nuclear weapons. And what was also another interesting point was a certain pattern noticed in certain films and TV series where there was a car in which the protagonists were driving through a demonstration and they were surrounded by enraged Iranian crowd. That was really interesting. Now, in regards to language representation, because it was another factor studied, I also looked into language representations and issues of translatability. So, as you can see, 14 out of 19 movies had no subtitle whatsoever. When something was uttered in Farsi, which is the official language of Iran, of course. And most of the films contained a few utterances, which were either basic phrases or salutation in Farsi, I'm sorry. But these salutations were spoken either by guards, villains, or people belonging to lower social strata, such as the maids, for example. Or what was also examined, it was when something was deemed as important for the plot and it was uttered in Farsi, it was translated by the white protagonist who seemed to know the Persian language. Now, this phenomena, the lack of subtitles, and the identification of the Persian language with characters that are described as villains imply a phenomenon of linguistic devaluation. And of course, a devaluation for a language and its speakers imply a devaluation for the ethnic background that these people belong to. In regards to the cultural representations, those films that can be described as negative or stereotypical made use of the of cultural appropriation depiction techniques, or they refer directly to cultural incompatibility issues, thus reflecting the ideological doctrine of the class of civilization as expressed by Dr. Samuel Huntington. Those films that can be described as either positive or neutral made frequent references to the Achaemenid dynasty or to the Achaemenid kings. So they had to date back to the pre-Islamic era in order to differentiate the Persian history of Iran to the modern Islamic Iran. These films also and the TV series, they refer to the great Iranian poets like Hafez, Rumi, and Samlou. And these films that can be described as either neutral or positive, they were the ones that contained more captions when something was uttered in Persian, or they had the highest percentages of Persian visibility, so to say. Now, and I will go to the next. Okay, yes, I have already spoken about language representation. As far as the political context is concerned, I don't know if you can see the next slide. So most of the films, yes, almost 55% of them were produced by when Barack Obama was a president. I think it was referred by Mr. Vedadipour previously. So most of the films was produced during that time. It is no a coincidence that he has been described as the first popular culture president by Professor Jack Holland. Now, Barack Obama has made use of diplomacy and of soft power, and he has frequently stated that Homeland was his favorite series. Of course, a great number of the films were produced when George Bush was president, and of course, they were in line with the ideological doctrine of the war on terror. Now, as far as Iran is concerned, and now I'm referring to the next slide. Yes, okay. That was the differencing point of my first assumption, because most of these Iranophobic and Islamophobic depictions of Iran, they were not increased after 2001. They took place between 2005 and 2015. That is when Mahmoud Ahmadinejad was president in Iran. Now, Ahmadinejad was not favored among West because of his rather inflammatory discourse, of course, because he made often anti-Semitic statements, and because he wanted to launch the Iranian nuclear program. These representations, the most stereotypical ones, they seem to decline after 2015, when the joint nuclear deal between the US, the European Union and Iran was signed. Another point that I would like to stress, it is on the next slide, if I'm not mistaken, and it's something that was stressed by Mr. Vedadipour previously. I totally agree with that, was that most of the films were either produced by Warner Bros. Or Fox Media, and those which were produced by those companies, which can be described as conglomerate media, as it has been stated by Noam Chomsky in his book Manufacturing Consent, it was those films that were most negative. These films that can be portrayed either as positive or neutral, they were European productions or independent productions whatsoever. Now, I would like to stress that it is really important. I had an example, but I don't think that I have a time to stress it to you anyway. What I wanted to say was that it is really important to it is really important to understand these Islamophobic and stereotypical depictions of Iran, and to stress them and highlight them whenever possible, because they are produced by the mass media of popular culture, that is cinema and TV series, that apply to the masses, which usually receive all the information that they receive from without infiltrating this information. And so all these stereotypical depictions, they breed a senses of bigotry, discrimination, and cultural classification of people classified as culturally supreme and culturally inferior, thus paving the way for new colonial narratives. I don't know if I can refer to the last not to this one, to the other one. Yes, to this one. That was this is a saying by Edward Said, which was the moral principle of with which the essay was written. It was sort of let's say the moral axis of my research in order to juxtapose this with the axis of evil in which Iran was positioned. Anyway, that what was Edward Said said was that underlying every interpretation of other culture, especially Islam, is a choice facing the individual scholar or intellectual, whether to put the intellect at the service of power or at the service of criticism, community, dialogue, and moral sense. Thank you. That would be all. I hope that it was conceivable, and thank you very much.
That was wonderful. Thank you. You really like powered through there with the technical. Thank you so much. Okay, yeah. So I think we'll begin with our panelists if they would like to ask questions of each other, and then I'm going to ask the audience as well to put your questions in the Q&A.
I think there's one question from Monique in the question box.
Yeah, we'll have first a discussion among the four of you, and then we'll turn to those.
Thank you so much, Angeliki, for your presentation. I'm glad that I wasn't too far off from my results for my data analysis as well then.
No, thank you. It was really illuminating what you said, and I really learned a great deal from you.
Thank you. Same here.
Okay, Brian, did you have any questions?
Yeah, sure. I do have many questions, but I have one for Mohammed Reza specifically. So one of the things that I really found compelling about your presentation was the focus that you had on these sort of mechanisms of causality. So focusing on, for example, the co-production, so the CIA's involvement in the production of Argo, and the influence of American politics and popular culture on representations of Iranian identity. And I maybe this is an unfair question to ask, but I mean, as major Hollywood studios consolidate, and as the focus on international markets increases, do you foresee any change in this sort of tight relationship that you identify between American politics and popular culture and representations of and representations shaped by and I guess the role of American politics and popular culture in shaping representations of countries like Iran?
Thank you so much, Brian. That's actually a very good question. I've been thinking about this a lot, especially because my the paper is quite reflective of my PhD at the moment. My PhD looks at the Muslim identity, so from the whole of North Africa and the Middle East. However, for this paper, I specifically focused on Iran, and this idea that because Iran doesn't have economic relationship with America, so it has hardly any leverage regarding the commercial side of how Hollywood works. But if you look in retrospect to what China was like a few years ago and how it was demonized and how it was portrayed, at the moment, just Hollywood's bending over backwards trying to find stories to incorporate Chinese and Chinese culture. And we saw with Mulan and so many other films. So this idea that because Iran doesn't have a trading relationship with America, the films that are released in Hollywood or by Hollywood studios are either bootlegged or downloaded illegally or whatever. In Iran, it has no, so it's not, it's not bothered. It doesn't care about how it represents Iran in that sense, in the commercial sense, because it has no disadvantage for it. But then as I went into it as an Iranian, thinking about how the Iranian identity, or one aspect of it, the political side aspect of the racial and religious side, as I grew up. And I think I had a more negative image going in of how we've been portrayed in the last 40 years than when I did the research. And I saw that so many films that I thought were racist, well, actually they were quite funny, or the way they represented it wasn't against the Iranian government or Iranian revolution itself. It was just about comical aspects of the Iranian identity, different aspects of it. So, and then the other thing that I noticed that I'm glad that Angeliki also highlighted is that during Obama's time, he has been the most successful at incorporating and including and influencing and building that relationship between Hollywood and his administration, because they, more when I put those research those films, I only specifically looked at major studios. I didn't look at independent films, because if I had, it would have gone into a bigger frame and the dynamics, it would have changed. I wanted to focus on the 82% of the market share, which is a big share. And so if I had looked at other films, there would have been more films about human rights. There would have been more films about terrorism. Even if I went into TV shows, especially with the streaming platforms now, with Apple, which has released a TV series about Iran called Tehran, and many other streaming platforms, it would have gone really big. It would have become a PhD thesis. So I wanted to specifically narrow it down to the 82% market share, and specifically major studios. But you're right. If there is a relationship between the Iranian kind of society, Iranian economy, and Hollywood economy, I'm pretty sure that you would see more nuances, more positive, neutral reflections. And there were some films, like for example, Body of Lies, which Senna Aziz mentioned in her in her presentation about Iraq. There is the negative Arab Muslim representation, but it's really interesting because in the same film, a woman whose father is Iranian, so by default she's presented Iranian, played by the Iranian actress, is actually a very positive, helpful, caring, and kind of character in the story that the non-Muslim viewer will identify, right? Because of the relationship she has with Leonardo DiCaprio. So there is a lot in the way that these films, and it's very, I went into the PhD just, brushing all of the Hollywood with the same brush of, negative Muslim stereotype, but it isn't the case. The more research I'm doing, I'm seeing nuances. They're not necessarily fair in the balance of between negative and positive, but I think it's happening more and more as we go along, and maybe trade relations will make a difference for that. Unfortunately, we have to see if the US government want to have a trade relationship with Iran, that will impact that in that way. Sorry for the long reply.
That was great. Thank you, Mohammed Reza.
I would just like to make one comment on what Mohammed Reza just said. In Body of Lies, you're very right. That is a positive representation of Iranian identity in that film, but more so that main character, that female, love interest of Leonardo DiCaprio, she, in my opinion, was more like a token, good Muslim character. On the other hand, her family, like her sister and her kids, the way that the tradition and family values were being shared on the table, that was more, I think, in a more positive light than the main character in that film, in my opinion.
I agree with you. I think she wasn't fully in the informer section of a good Muslim. She did push back to some extent. However, her sister, you're absolutely right, did challenge, the idea of empire, and did challenge the idea of war on terrorism and so forth. So you're absolutely right. Her sister and the family of the sister were more to the point of being more, if you want to say, genuine representation of the other side of Muslim identity. I agree with you 100%.
Wonderful. So I'll move into the Q&A box. Monique has a question for you, Angeliki. Monique writes, I think I missed it. How did you select the films for your analysis? I mean, did you use Internet Movie Database, IMDb, to identify films and TV series that had Iranian characters, or was the selection based on the film's series topic of war or conflict between the US and Iran? Thanks for clarifying this methodological question.
Thank you, and thank you for Monique for the question. So the selection was based on the chronology of which the film were released. So basically, all the TV episodes, because for example, let's take the example of West Wing. There were some episodes referring to Iran after 2000. Those were analyzed and they were incorporated in the research. Everything that was released after 2001, it was considered as an integral part of the research, because I wanted to see how the ideology is disseminated over there, because the basic point that I wanted to see was that if after 9/11 the portrayal of Iranians as the negative portrayal of Iranians increased or not. And it was not what I believed. So it was not increased after 2001. It was increased after Mohammed became a president, as I was stressed before. So they were all the films or TV series that I was able to find after 2001 were released after that. Now, it was not easy to find these independent or European and American co-productions, but I wanted to see these films as well, because they were shedding a different light into their portrayals of Iran. And it was interesting to see that too. So I was based basically only on chronological order. I'm not sure if I answered that correctly, or if you want any more clarification. Think about that.
Thank you, Angeliki. We have, I think, a question that's it's meant to engage all of the presenters on the panel from our esteemed colleague, Salah Hassan. So, Brian, Mohammed Reza, Angeliki, and Senna, if you could answer this question. The question reads as follows. In the conversation on global Islamophobia on Thursday, the point was made that anti-Muslim bigotry is different in distinct global contexts. Expression of anti-Muslim policies and attitudes in the US are different in Europe or India or in China, etc. Do the panelists think that there are different forms of Islamophobia and the representation of different ethnic groups that are perceived as Muslims, Turks versus Iranians, Arabs versus South Asians, etc.?
I can take up that question with reference to my research. I mean, I would certainly suggest that Islamophobia, like most Islamophobia is multiple and contested in Germany as it is in other contexts. And there is a certain multiple characterizability that I think is quite important at least in the story that I'm telling. So Turkish Muslims were differentiated very strongly in the 1980s in West Germany from other Muslims. I mean, Germany in the 1980s was a country dominated, numerically at least. The Muslim community was dominated by Turkish citizens, but there were small non-Turkish Muslim minorities who nevertheless were sort of caught up in the engagement between the German and Turkish governments on the regulation of Islam. So for example, German Muslims, so ethnic German Muslims, some converts, some children or grandchildren of immigrants were deeply frustrated with the visa policy, which only permitted imams and religious teachers from Turkey to immigrate to. I recall a letter written in 1987 by one German Muslim who criticized the West German government's attitude that Islam is a Turkish state religion, not a world religion. But for the purposes of regulating, for the purposes of dealing with what was perceived to be a particular threat, with what was perceived to be an opaque and foreign set of practices, it certainly makes sense that Islam was reduced to Turkishness. It offered a way of regulating, a way out of this dilemma that West German security services or found themselves in the 1980s. So this differentiation between different types of Muslims is certainly present. We certainly see this fade later in the story that I'm telling. And this differentiation it served a particular purpose for particularly state actors involved in the construction of Islam as a threat.
Thank you so much for your comments, Brian. I would just like to add one small thing, that rather than ethnic differences, I think talking about Hollywood, there are traces of foreign policy when a certain national identity is kind of targeted as the essential villain in the movies. Sometimes it's Iraqi, sometimes it's Palestinian during the 70s, as we know. But more to the point of ethnic differences in the ethnic based Islamophobia or Islamophobic representation, I have not seen that much.
Can I just quickly add interesting point? There's actually a few organizations. One, MPAC Hollywood Bureau in California, and there's a new organization set up in the UK recently that wants to educate and is there to educate filmmakers, Hollywood filmmakers in general, media, content producers, TV, whatever, to explain to them the differences within the Muslim identity. So Muslim Turks or Iranians or Arabs, or even within Arabs, you have Jordanians, Palestinians, Moroccans, Tunisians, Egyptians, Saudi Arabians. It's a whole spectrum of different identities, different, denominations, Shia, Sunni, Sufi, Salafi, whatever. This lack of education that exists within Hollywood and other media content producers, unfortunately, represents. So I've seen films that are supposed to be set in Pakistan, but they're filmed in Morocco. And from the way the people look and the dress that they have, the dishtasha is completely different to a shalwar kameez. And the language on the billboard, a normal person who knows a bit of Arabic reading or just a bit understanding different between the cultures can see that the authenticity of the film is lacking. So it's very difficult to engage with it. So it's many elements of it. One is the lack of education within the Western media content producers, directors, film writers, screenwriters, executive producers, so forth. And one, laziness, just relying on tropes that they've seen in movies or programs or whatever. And another one is effort from Muslim citizens living in the West. We have to go and reach out. We have to provide the correctness. One example of this that works is if any of you have seen the 1999 Three Kings with George Clooney and Mark Wahlberg. That film was influenced by the late Professor Dr. Shaheen. He engaged with the screenwriter before the film was made to explain to him the difference between Arabs, Shias, Sunnis, you know, the whole context of everything. And so when you watch the movie, you realize the accents, the actors or the people who use have Arabic accents. There's a different explanation. You understand where the sheer kind of context of the story is. So it's such a more in-depth, nuanced film that I would include in one of the positive representations of the Muslims within, even though there is, you know, Muslim soldiers which are harsh and horrible. The fact that it's nuanced makes it a film that you can include in a positive representation. So I think there's a need for us Muslims and who live in the West to engage, and the need for the media content producers to be open to engagement and to learn, because ultimately the more nuanced their films are, the more it opens up to Muslim audiences who are happy to watch and enjoy, like as I said, the film Three Kings.
Could I add another remark on that? First of all, yes, I totally agree with Mr. Vedadipour and what he said. I wanted to stress something else. I don't that I've noticed in my research. I don't know if Islamophobic discourse changes in regards to the ethnic background that they are portraying, to the people that they are portraying. But I think that this change is in line with the change encountered in racist discourse in general. So, for example, now they don't refer to the ethnic differences so much, so they are referring to the cultural differences, and that is what is really important, that this ideological doctrine of the class of civilization, it is expressed either by cultural appropriation or by any means possible in cinematography and in TV series as well. And I don't think that it is so innocent. It happens specifically on purpose. So they are not referring to let's say they are not referring to the so-called really stereotypical representations, but when they are making people as culturally incompatible, it is, let's say, sort of the same. This is what I would like to stress.
Thank you so much, Angeliki. And thank you all to all of the panelists. We are at our time limit. So we have a 15-minute break before the next panel. And I encourage you all to come for our last panel, which will be followed with, if anyone would like to have just a broader conversation about the media and portrayals and attitudes and consequences. So thank you all for a really tremendous discussion.
Thank you.